So now it's time to build a commander deck. But if you're like me, you don't want to simply build a deck that's been built before, right? You don't really want to just put all of the best and expensive pieces in the most popular commanders, do you? I mean, you don't want to be the millionth Magic player to put together an Atraxa deck, right? That's boring, unoriginal, and expensive. Unlike you beautiful destroyer of worlds. You are a unique and creative individual that likes to do things in commander decks that no one has ever done before. Today, I get to share with you how I work through the deck building process, while at the same time sharing with you a commander deck that, as far as I know, no one has put together this way. Curious? Let's go.
Space Coconut.
One of the first things you're going to do when building a commander deck is, of course, picking your commander. It's going to dictate the colors you'll have available, and more often, it will affect your attack plan, since some commanders and colors are better at some strategies than others. When Extus Oriq Overlord was spoiled, I really liked the aristocratic possibilities that he presented. But it was really obvious that that was the direction the deck would be taken by the majority of players. However, the fact that he had double strike in red seemed like an unnecessary keyword, and one that every other deck decided to ignore. So of course, I decided to make him a Voltron deck. Now that I had a commander and a theme, I needed to figure out how to make the thing work. Extus's ability brings creatures back to your hand when you cast or copy a spell, and Voltron strategies typically utilize equipments, auras, and counters to make their commanders massive. Extus doesn't have that synergy, so we have to ask ourselves, in the thousands of cards available, are there creatures that buff other creatures? Of course there are, but the majority of those types of cards will only buff creature types like zombies, goblins, and things like that are better suited to tribal decks, or even worse, effects that we have to pay mana into. A quick search on the MTG Gatherer page will give us the answers we need. Now, there's another MTG search engine called Scryfall that exists, but if you look at the search results, you'll find that when we search for the term, gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. Scryfall doesn't pick up the instructional text found on cards that explain a keyword. Using that same search string in Gatherer, we reveal the winner. In our case, the answer to our problems is a single keyword: Exalted. Exalted says whenever a creature you control attacks alone, that creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is perfect because ideally we're only going to be attacking with Extus. So let's find all of the Exalted cards in our colors. We end up with Cathedral of War, Akrasan Squire, Duty-Bound Dead, Goblin Champion, Aven Squire, Knight of Glory, Knight of Infamy, Sigiled Paladin, Guardians of Akrasa, Servant of Nephorox, Duskmantle Prowler, Angelic Benediction, Sublime Archangel, which is the best creature in the deck because it gives all of our creatures Exalted, and if a creature already has Exalted, it triggers twice. And then there's Battlegrace Angel, which will also give the attacking creature lifelink on the attack. Now, this of course isn't nearly enough creatures for this kind of deck, and Angelic Benediction is an enchantment, while Cathedral of War is a land. So we need to continue our search for creatures that will buff our commander. But before we do that, if we take a quick peek at any of the early Extus deck techs on YouTube, we'll hear them mention the adventure cards from the Throne of Eldraine, and that leads us to the next tip. Watching deck techs can give you tips on how to solve problems you've run into making a particular deck with a certain commander, as well as give you inspiration to do things you didn't think about. These Throne of Eldraine cards are creatures, but you can cast them for their adventure cost and then exile them to cast their creature cost later. Adventures are instances and sorceries, so they'll trigger Extus to bring creatures back from your graveyard to your hand. Cast the creature later and you'll have a body on board, and if it goes to the graveyard, you can get it back to your hand by casting another spell. It's possible to get a few extra uses out of them, so it's worth it to put a few of the better ones in. Those would be like Order of Midnight, which can get 2 creatures back, Embereth Shieldbreaker, which will destroy an artifact, Giant Killer will destroy a big creature, and the creature side can tap creatures down as well. Foulmire Knight will draw a card at instant speed and exist as a Death Touch blocker later, easily getting itself into the graveyard for Extus to recycle later. When Murderous Rider dies, it goes to the bottom of your library for some reason. At that point, it's just a murder, and not exactly ideal, but it's still a creature with lifelink that we can swing and get some life if we need it bad enough. Lastly, Merchant of the Veil does something we absolutely need. We can discard a card and draw a card, and then the creature has that same ability. For me, sometimes cards themselves will remind me of a problem I need to solve before I even remember that it's a problem. Merchant of the Veil did this for me when I first built this deck. In order to get the most use out of Extus's ability, we need to get creatures into the graveyard. More importantly, we need to make sure that we lose as few instances and sorceries as possible due to the mill effects, because we have very few ways to get those back into our hand. Drawing cards is essential, and something you need to make sure you have built into your deck. Looting effects are exactly what we need here, because we can choose to discard creatures and keep spells in our hand to get those creatures back later, or even in the same turn. Cathartic Reunion says as an additional cost to cast the spell, discard 2 cards. This is very important because of Extus's ability. To cast the spell, you need to pay the mana and discard the cards. Then, when you cast the spell, Extus's ability triggers, and you can get one of those cards back if it's a creature card, bypassing the downside of this type of card entirely. For the instances, I have Big Score and Thrill of Possibility. At sorcery speed, we have Cathartic Reunion, Tormenting Voice, and Wild Guess. And now that I'm looking at my card list, I don't have nearly enough of these effects. So what I'll do later is look through the least important cards and see which ones I can replace with more card draw effects. This is why I like the Moxfield website for deck adjustments. It helps me visualize what I have and where the weak points might be. This deck will be up there for you to take a peek and approve as you see fit if you end up building it yourself. Hazoret's Monument will reduce red creature spell costs by 1, but most importantly, whenever we cast a creature card of any color, we can discard a card and draw a card. Bone Shards won't draw you cards, but you can kill a creature or planeswalker for 1 black mana after you get the discarded card back with Extus, which is a pretty good deal. Okay, so now we have our main group of creatures to make Extus huge, and spells to help draw cards and get creatures back to our hand. Next, we need to worry about protecting Extus from the wrath of our opponents. Let's go back to the creatures and add more to help protect Extus and make sure he can get through the opponent's line of defense. Selfless Spirit and Selfless Samurai can protect our creatures at instant speed through a noble sacrifice, and then come back to our hand later with the cast of a spell. For spells, we're running Swiftfoot Boots, Bolt Bend, God's Willing, Dawn Charm, Boros Charm, Rebuff the Wicked, and Lapse of Certainty. I should add more cards for this, but for now I'm only running 2 enchantment removal, Revoke Existence and Mortify. It might be worth it to swap other creatures for Felidar Cub, Keening Apparition, and Kami of Ancient Law to get rid of problematic enchantments. Now Extus is going to be blocked by your opponent's creatures, so we want to make sure he can get through. Whisper Silk Cloak, Wave of Indifference, Cosmotronic Wave, Insight Hysteria, and Order/Chaos will remove the ability to block from our opponent's creatures, and if Extus is big enough, it'll also remove their ability to stay in the game. Ride Down is fun because chances are high they'll just chump block Extus, and then you can simply kill the creature, give Extus Trample, and the opponent will be taking a full hit while at the same time getting a creature back from your graveyard. All for a red and white mana. The last equipment I'm running is my favorite, Haunted Cloak. It costs 3 and equips for 1, but it gives your creature Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. It's pretty decent for our attack plan, right? Silent Arbiter will make sure only one of their creatures can block, and since we're only attacking with 1 creature, the downside is irrelevant. Archetype of Aggression will make sure that our damage can spill over their blockers with Trample, as well as prevent our opponents from trampling over our group of small creatures. Iroas, God of Victory, will give Extus Menace and prevent any damage that would be done to him. Ishin, 2 Heavens as 1, will make every Exalted trigger happen twice, so with just 1 Exalted creature on the field, you'll make Extus a 4/6 double strike, dealing 8 commander damage, killing your opponent in 3 hits if nothing changes. And Dreadhorde Arcanist can let us recast spells from our graveyard, triggering Extus if we're in a pinch. The Exalted triggers will make him large enough to cast any spell from our graveyard, which could be game-changing. This will happen twice if Ishin is out. Shreds of Sanity is in here for the same reason, in case we need a specific spell from our graveyard to use at the right time. Elspeth Knight Errant should enter the turn after Extus does, and by using her second ability, you'll be able to swing with a 5/7 flying double strike commander. Tainted Strike can end the game for an opponent if you can get Extus's power to 4, because poison is stupid. Kedis Emberclaw Familiar will let you hit the entire table for damage if Extus gets through, and Kelith Sunmane Familiar will give Extus a 1/1 counter every time he attacks. Nearheath Pilgrim will soul bond to Extus, giving him lifelink. Buried Alive is important because it will get the 2 best creatures into our graveyard, Anger and Sublime Archangel. The last creature you put into the graveyard is up to you depending on the board state. I'd pick between Silent Arbiter, Irois, Ishin, or the Archetype of Aggression. Now, since we'll be discarding a lot of cards, we can run Anger to give Extus haste, and while it might not be the best option, I put Bloodsword Steward in to give Extus +2/+2 and haste as well. Leaning into the recursion aspect of Extus, we can run some of those spells as well. Savine's Reclamation will get something back to our hand and directly onto the battlefield for 3 mana, and if you cast it for its flashback cost, you'll get 2 creatures into your hand and 2 creatures onto the battlefield for 5 mana. This works because Extus's ability is for spells cast and copied. Raise Dead can bring 2 creatures back to your hand for 1 mana, which is a great deal as well. Now, this deck isn't refined, and it'll be obvious when I share the mana ramp package that I'm using right now. Soul Ring, Talisman of Conviction, Burrow Signet, Arcane Signet, Cloud Key naming creatures, and the Ecologist's Terrarium are what I'm running right now. The idea here is just to use what you have to help you get your creatures out sooner and get Extus out at the right time to do the most damage on his first attack. Now, you should always have a backup plan. If your opponent manages to kill Extus 1 too many times, you can still attack with the creatures you have utilizing the Exalted triggers to make them massive. If you manage to get several of them out and your opponents are at a very low life total, you can even sacrifice those creatures to the backside of Extus to cast Awaken the Blood Avatar. Each creature you sacrifice pays for 2 of the mana cost of the spell, which includes the commander tax. It will also force your opponents to sacrifice a creature, and then you get a 3/6 black-red avatar creature token with haste, and when it attacks, it deals 3 damage to each opponent. So the opponent you attack would be hit for 6 damage in total, and that's assuming you don't have any exalted creatures on the field. It's definitely not ideal, but it's there in case of an emergency. And as long as I didn't miss anything, the rest of the deck should be lands and you can use whatever you have, since this isn't exactly a super powerful deck. It's pretty important that you use whatever cards you have in your collection first before buying cards for a deck. I've made the mistake of buying cards I thought I'd use and then ended up cutting it from the deck it was meant for. I'm a cheapskate, and I really only spend like $5 on any single card unless it's literally the best card for the strategy I'm going for, and I have the spare change for it. The point here is to simply be smart when buying cards. I'm not sure if I was able to help clear up deck building for you, but the idea here is to break up each problem into its own section and pick cards that solve the problem and work with the theme of your deck at the same time. Then you can just play the deck a few times and take out the cards that don't do what you want or don't seem to help you when it's in your hand and replace them with other, better options. This is a continuous process and one that my original Teysa deck has been through ever since she was released in January 2019 with Ravnica Allegiance. Recently, Teysa actually became Minthara, and if you want to see that deck tech, I'll link that below. There are thousands of options, and this Extus deck is far from perfect, but you can clearly see where those issues are, and with a little research, you can find the right cards to improve it. If you break up your own deck idea this way and hone it over time, you'll find yourself with a deck that you can be proud of, even if it doesn't utterly crush your opponents. Let me know what you thought of Extus, Voltron, Overlord, and whether this little guide helped you with your deck building even a tiny bit. If there are still questions you have, feel free to leave them in the comment section and I'll answer what I can. Also, leave any suggestions for the next video you might want to see in the future. But anyway, that's it for today. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike it if you disliked it, and until next time, I'm Space Coconut, and you're welcome.